Our story today begins in a charming little house at number 4 Gribnitzstrasse in Neubabelsberg, a beautiful town near Potsdam in Germany. It's June 30th, 1934, around noon. A car carrying 6 men, all in plain clothes, stops in front of the house and the driver stays in his seat. 5 men get out of the car and, walking calmly, head toward the door of the house. They ring the bell and are let in by the housekeeper. Strangely, she doesn't ask for the identity of the men. Marie Guntel, that's the name of the housekeeper, leads the 5 well-dressed gentlemen into the study where the owner of the house is. He is an elderly man who is opening his mail with a letter opener. The 5 men do not introduce themselves. They simply ask the owner whether his name is the one they have in mind. Upon receiving an affirmative answer, the 5 draw pistols and shoot the man at point-blank range. Immediately after, they turn their weapons on the wife sitting on a nearby sofa, who tried to react and kill her as well. The housekeeper is stunned and collapses to the ground, fainting. The 5 reach the door. Then, the car that had been waiting for them on the street drives off and they disappear. It's a murder, a brutal murder. What happens that day, shortly before lunchtime, on June 30th, 1934, a significant date for Germany, because it is the night of the Long Knives. But that man killed in his study is not a member of the SA. He is not one of Ernst Röhm's many subordinates. He is not even a Nazi. He is a retired military officer, a general, a former head of government, a former chancellor. That man's name was Kurt von Schleicher, and that brutal, sensational murder marks the end of his life. But above all, it was a bloody settling of scores, ordered by the very leaders of the nascent Nazi regime. We started this video by telling you about the violent death of Kurt von Schleicher. But who exactly was Kurt von Schleicher? A soldier, a former military man, a general, a politician, a man who, from December 1932 until the end of January 1933, had been Chancellor of the Weimar Republic, a conservative, a man used to mediating on multiple fronts, a trustworthy man, at least that's how he was considered by President of the Reich von Hindenburg, a man who could solve many problems. He had been a career military man. He had attended the military academy, then the war academy, and held positions in the general staff. There, he had met several men who would go on to have great careers like him. The lieutenant colonel at the time, that was his rank, Wilhelm Gröner, but also Joachim von Stülpnagel, one of the key men in the future of the complex anti-Hitler operation, known as Operation Valkyrie. Kurt von Schleicher had spent the period of the Great War mainly on the Western Front, in France and Flanders. He had taken part in the Battle of Verdun. He was then transferred as the first General Staff Officer to the 237th Infantry Division. His career, which began as a simple cadet and then as an ensign, progressed rapidly during the Great War. He also became a close collaborator and advisor to Hans von Zecht. This name should sound familiar to you. We've already talked about him. The father of the Blitzkrieg, the father of the Reichswehr, the ideal mentor of many future generals of the Second World War. Von Zecht had chosen von Schleicher as his close collaborator and advisor within the army reform, starting from 1920. But von Schleicher was not just a military man. In 1923, when the German political crisis became increasingly pressing, with the communist uprisings in Thuringia and Saxony, with Hitler's beer hall putsch at the Burgerbräukeller in Bavaria, and with other events of public unrest, von Schleicher had proposed to resolve those crises through a tool, the emergency clause, present in the Weimar Constitution. At the time, he was not yet a lieutenant colonel. He was still a major, but he had exercised his influence within the Reichswehr to have the military units intervene to suppress the various uprisings, both communist and nationalist ones, thanks to his role. Von Schleicher was seen in a very positive light in Berlin by the conservative establishment, the parties of the historic German right, representatives of the old landed nobility and the big industrialists, who at that time, so tumultuous and difficult, were seeking reliable leaders for the state, capable not so much of carrying out reforms, but of maintaining the increasingly difficult dialogue with the victorious Allied powers, and the need to unify the state, avoiding dangerous radical lurches, both on the far left and on the far right. In that period, and we are on the verge of the Great Crisis, the Great Economic Depression of 1929, von Schleicher already had a very important role within the Reichswehr ministry, which he had joined on the 1st of February 1929. Von Schleicher has a position equivalent to that of Secretary of State. He has access not only to the personnel office, but also to all those other offices that determine the political pressures on Germany. It is a fragile Germany, not only economically, where the mark continues to devalue, and at times is not even worth the paper and ink it is printed on. It is a fragile Germany because it cannot achieve stability, above all, political stability. Von Schleicher is one of the most active at that time, speaking within the Ministry of the Reichswehr, speaking with the Ministry of the Interior of the Reich. He also begins to enjoy the favor of the old Field Marshal von Hindenburg, who was elected president of the Reich. One of the political plans developed by von Schleicher is that of a presidential cabinet. That is, a direct intervention by the president, using his own power, to guide the formation of a government that directly responds to the wishes of the president himself. It would be almost a reintroduction of the old abolished monarchy. But all this is seen within various conservative parties as the only lifeline to avoid dangerous tendencies on the part of the state. In December 1929, while the economic situation is deteriorating, von Schleicher begins to talk with other conservatives. He talks, for example, with the state secretary at the Reich Chancellery, Hermann Tunder. He talks with the conservative populist Gottfried Treviranus. He talks with the conservatives of the Center Party, those of Heinrich Brüning. There is only one topic: the search for a new chancellor, a figure who is well liked by the various factions of the Reichstag, but even more so, someone who is accepted both by the Germans and by the parties that want to preserve Germany. Within the conservative reactionary camp, at this moment, von Schleicher also meets Franz von Papen, a German Catholic and politician. The intrigues within the Center Party go directly toward the chancellorship. Franz von Papen had already met Kurt von Schleicher briefly. They had shared a common path within the Army General Staff, but they hadn't deepened their acquaintance at that time. Only later did von Papen and von Schleicher begin to march in the same direction. And it is precisely when Franz von Papen begins his own political rise, guided by von Hindenburg to control and contain the Nazi rise, that von Schleicher becomes a minister. On June 1st, 1932, von Schleicher retires with the rank of infantry general to become the independent minister of the Reichswehr. The Reichstag elections of July 31st, 1932, strengthened the Nazi element in the Reichstag. There are more and more Nazi deputies present who sit in the chamber wearing their characteristic brown shirts and never miss an opportunity to cause chaos, to leave the parliamentary proceedings in protest, and to obstruct the actions of the government. The Nazis have only one goal: to seize power. They tried with the putsch, and it didn't work. They tried by supporting Ludendorff for the presidency, and that went badly for them. The only strategy they are now pursuing is to increase, election after election, their influence within Parliament, to force the other parties to negotiate and to compel von Hindenburg to appoint Adolf Hitler as Chancellor. Hindenburg won't hear of it. He has no intention whatsoever of even talking to the man he considers a vulgar Austrian corporal who made his career in an unworthy way. Von Hindenburg has two weapons, von Papen and von Schleicher. But von Papen is weak. His attempt to control the Nazis by offering Hitler the vice-chancellorship quickly fades. On November 6, 1932, the Germans once again return to the polls. And the results are terrifying because the Nazis gain even more power, even more seats, and they can influence the Reichstag even more. It is at this moment that von Papen resigns and von Schleicher takes his place. Initially, von Papen doubts von Schleicher's loyalty. He thinks it was the old general who sabotaged his cabinet. He even tells Hindenburg, "Schleicher has betrayed me." Schleicher knew from the very beginning that my government wouldn't last, and he did everything to bring about my downfall, to become chancellor himself and to negotiate with the Nazis himself. Von Hindenburg is not happy about it, but he trusts von Schleicher, who has a strategy in mind. That strategy leads straight to Gregor Strasser, a prominent figure within the Nazi Party, a faction leader, specifically of the revolutionary activist wing. We could say almost the left-wing faction of the Nazi movement. But exactly, there's a catch. Georg Strasser does not have control of the Nazi Party. When Strasser goes to Hitler for negotiations, bringing von Schleicher's plan to bring the Nazis into the government, but in exchange for an oath of loyalty and, above all, a role for Georg Strasser himself, Hitler flies into a rage. He accuses Strasser of being a traitor, of betraying the Nazi cause, of selling out the party. Strasser is forced to resign and leave. The total clash between Hitler and Hindenburg sees von Schleicher not in the background, but engaged in intense negotiations. Schleicher initially thinks he can control Hitler himself, that he can appease him, that he can offer him important ministerial positions to satisfy him. He also counts, at least in the initial moves, on the support of the agrarian right-wing parties and the centrist parties. But suddenly the situation changes. Even financial support and backing from the press are not enough. Schleicher has no hold on the German public. The Germans prefer Hitler. They prefer that little man who goes around the squares, shouts, incites, denounces the peace treaties, and promises not only social redemption for all Germans. Von Schleicher complains about all this. He sees plots against him. In a letter addressed to the Crown Prince, dated December 27, 1932, von Schleicher writes, "In Berlin, it seems that a united front is forming, with Hitler, Papen, and Stülpnagel actively working with the goal of overthrowing the chancellorship through the president and doing so before new elections." Von Schleicher realizes he no longer has the strength. On January 4, 1933, in a meeting with Hitler at the home of banker Kurt Freiherr von Schröder, the drama unfolds. The final act. It is at that moment that Schleicher also loses the support of von Papen, who sides with the Nazis, gets a prestigious role from them, and abandons the general, who can no longer continue. The next day, a newspaper. The newspaper Grundschau publishes a headline, "Hitler and Papen against Schleicher." 2 days later, the same newspaper publishes more details about that meeting. They are titled "The Counterattack of Industry" and "The Mystery of the Stray Bullet of Cologne." The articles refer in quite some detail to the course of the talks that took place. They talk about the Stahlhelm, the Steel Helmet League, an extremist movement. They talk about the industrialists who have now decided to place their trust in Hitler himself. They talk about the fact that von Schleicher is a dead man walking, politically speaking. Von Schleicher tries, until the end, to save his own cabinet, but he realizes he is increasingly alone. The final blow comes when rumors about his health start circulating in the newspapers. The Nazis have actually managed to get their hands on some medical reports made by Schleicher's family doctor. The general suffers from pernicious anemia, and because of this, the newspapers write, his health and his integrity as head of government are seriously compromised. Some even talk about a deadly disease on the way, even a carcinoma. These are low-level speculations. But Schleicher can't take it anymore. He can't go on, he can't hold out. On January 28, 1933, Schleicher goes to President von Hindenburg's residence and announces his own resignation, as well as that of the government. Almost with shame, he recommends to the President of the Reich that Hitler be appointed as his successor. Von Hindenburg's reaction is disheartened. According to the chronicles of the time, General von Schleicher is said to have heard these words from the old field marshal. "Thank you, General, for everything you have done for our homeland. Now let's see how things go, and we believe that God's help will be needed to save us." Within a few days, news breaks. A government is formed, the Hitler government. It is the end of the Weimar Republic. Or if you prefer, it is the beginning of the end of the Republic. Von Schleicher prefers to retire from public life. He refuses any other position. He also leaves the official residence at the Reichswehr ministry. The one insisting on it is Werner von Blomberg, a general who a few years later will end up on the Nazis' blacklist. He too will be forced to resign, with a scandal that was deliberately fabricated, the one involving his wife, the new wife, a beautiful woman younger than the general. She was suspected of being a prostitute. In fact, she was openly accused of being a former prostitute. But von Blomberg doesn't know this yet. He still believes that the Nazis will help him advance his career. Von Schleicher, as mentioned, withdraws. He refuses any position. He even refuses the possibility of leading an armed coup to overthrow Hitler, and to entrust the president of the Reich, von Hindenburg, with full powers, bypassing the Constitution. Von Schleicher has decided to close a chapter of his life forever, and he is convinced that he will be forgotten both by the Germans and by history. His calculations will prove to be wrong. As we saw at the beginning, on June 30th, 1934, shortly before lunchtime, a team from the Sicherheitsdienst, the SS security service in civilian clothes, knocks on his door. The housekeeper lets those 5 men in. They head toward the study. They ask the person they find sitting at the desk if he is Kurt von Schleicher, and when he answers yes, they draw their pistols, and they kill both him and his wife. Who did it? Who bears the clear historical responsibility for that brutal murder? According to historians, there are 2 possible names. One, Johannes Schmidt, a man from the SZ, that is, the Sicherheitsdienst. A few years ago, a book was published dedicated specifically to this person, and to the theory that he was the one who led the hit squad that killed von Schleicher and his wife. But it could also have been another accomplice of his, Heinrich Pfeiffer, another SS member involved in the purges during that period, and who, several years later, under a pseudonym, would recount in a book the early experiences of the Nazi state. Also regarding the murders and purges following the Night of the Long Knives, whether it was Pfeiffer, whether it was Schmidt. What is known is that the order came from very high up. It's unlikely that it was Hitler himself, even though Hitler personally hated Schleicher, but he hated Georg Strasser even more. He was also killed on the same day. According to historians, there are 3 possible masterminds: Himmler, head of the SS, Heydrich, future head of the Reich Main Security Office, or Goering, who had just created the Gestapo in those days. One of these 3, or maybe all 3 together, in concert. They had decided that on the occasion of eliminating the old SA comrades, it was also time to deal with all the other opponents, internal ones like Strasser, or external ones like von Schleicher, who at that moment was nothing more than a former politician and former general, retired, who was enjoying his retirement in his elegant villa outside Potsdam, together with his wife and the housekeeper. It's clear that the death of von Schleicher and his murder was the result of a desire for revenge, remembering the power struggle that had taken place in the previous 2 years. Yet something doesn't add up, because a couple of hours after the murder, another team arrived, this time in uniform. They showed up at that villa with an arrest warrant for Kurt von Schleicher. So how is that possible? The general had been killed before he was arrested. And why? Why sign an arrest order for a dead man walking? Or why kill a political opponent before bringing him to a court that was already manipulated by the emerging Nazi regime? Who decided that von Schleicher had to die? And above all, why did he have to die in that way, according to other historians? The complex relationships of von Schleicher with other major figures of the armed forces. For example, General Kurt von Hammerstein-Eckert, or his relationships with some members of the press. For instance, the journalist Hans Rudolf Berboth. They might have hinted at something else. Perhaps von Schleicher was the keeper of unspeakable secrets. For example, other medical records, not his own, but those of Hitler. They disappeared from the Passewalk military hospital, and were buried in some safe in 1934, even though he was already a retired military man turned politician. Von Schleicher still had a considerable influence in military and political circles, and his extensive network of contacts. It could still lead to the emergence of a small internal opposition. Who wanted to eliminate him? Clearly, they didn't just want to take revenge for what had happened before. They also wanted to discourage any attempt at opposition to the emerging regime. You could say that with the death of Kurt von Schleicher, with those gunshots. The Weimar Republic definitively died as well. A few days later, Hitler would decide to restructure the state. And when the old von Hindenburg breathes his last breath, the possibility of uniting in a single office, in a single person, the presidency and the chancellorship, would clear the way, without any obstacles, for dictatorship. In this context, von Schleicher could have been the last obstacle, the expression of the old Prussian elite, the expression of the old imperial army, which could still have influence over certain sectors of German society, from the army, obviously, up to the representatives of the landed nobility. So, killing the general, retired, along with his wife, without the culprits ever being found, could have been a signal. Getting in Hitler's way, or even just thinking about slowing down his rise, could have cost everyone dearly. And even just thinking about stopping the emerging regime would have been difficult, bloody, and the price. The final price would have been paid with their life, just as it had been for Kurt von Schleicher.